From MTN, the Montana Television Network, this is Face the State.
Good morning and welcome to Face the State. Nearly 30% of Montana's land is owned and managed by the federal government. In April, President Donald Trump signed an executive order directing Secretary of Interior Ryan Zinke to review all national monuments created from 1996 onward, including the Missouri Breaks and Bears Ears in Utah. That final review is expected soon. Here to discuss this review and the fate of federal public land more generally, I've invited two thought leaders to the show. Terry Anderson is a former Montana State University professor and past president of the Property and Environmental Research Center here in Bozeman, and currently a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute. Shane Doyle is a member of the Crow tribe, an educator who's taught at Montana State, and a founding member of Hold Our Ground, an organization dedicated to protecting Montana's national monuments. Gentlemen, thanks for taking time out of really busy schedules here in the summer to join us on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
So, national monuments, let's just start at kind of the top here, right? Can you tell us what the national monument distinction means and why this distinction in the creation of national monuments is so controversial? I guess we'll start with Terry and then we'll talk to Shane here a little bit about that.
Well, the way national monuments are managed varies considerably, almost from being like wilderness areas to having much more development in them. The size varies considerably. The designations go all the way back to 1906 when the Antiquities Act was passed. And one could say that it was really passed as an effort to prevent pot stealing from the cliff dwellings in New Mexico, Arizona, and so on, Utah, and has now become much broader than that. The first national monument created was in Wyoming. It was Devil's Tower, clearly a sacred place for Native Americans, and fit quite well under the Antiquities Act. It's more controversial today because those monuments are bigger and encompass much more than what would be thought of as antiquities, meaning tribal sites and so on.
And Shane, of course, we have some national monuments here in Montana. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about how those areas are managed and what makes them distinctive, some of the national monuments here.
Well, like Terry mentioned, there's a combination of management strategies that are used. There are 3 national monuments here in Montana. The Little Bighorn National Monument is managed by the National Park Service along with Pompey's Pillar. But the Missouri Breaks Monument is actually managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And they're all diverse, as Terry mentioned. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Some of them are open to some development. Others are shut off, of course, like the Little Bighorn Monument. And I'm proud to say that I grew up outside of the Little Bighorn National Monument, and that place is very important to me and my family, to my ancestors, to my children. And I've learned a lot from it, and very thankful to have that in my backyard.
So, different management strategies. Now, of course, National Park managing Pompey's Pillar, we have BLM, and if my understanding is correct, the BLM management was kind of a creation of Bill Clinton back in 1996, if I've got that right. What are the real distinctions between BLM management, park management, and do other agencies manage other monuments? What are the different strategies and between the different monuments?
Well, if you look at those the 2 main departments responsible, BLM and the Park Service, you only need to look at at what they do. I mean, you think of national parks and you think of Yellowstone, you think of Yosemite, and they're primarily there because of scenic values, primarily there to get people there to see the wonderful treasures of nature that we have in the United States. The Bureau of Land Management is an agency dedicated to multiple use management, land of many uses. And so very different missions, and therefore when you're trying to protect something, very much more conflict, I think, for BLM than for the Park Service. The Park Service, again, is a protective agency per se. You don't argue about should there be oil development in Yellowstone, whereas the BLM has lands that have oil, they have grazing, they have recreation, and that makes it harder, I think, for the BLM. But we should also note that the tribes, and if you take Canyon de Chelly, for example, the Navajo are very much in the management seat at Canyon de Chelly. and I think that's very appropriate. I wish the Crow had more. Had a real seat at the table in the Little Bighorn. It ought to be yours to manage, in my opinion.
Well, let's look at the Missouri Breaks, for example, right? So that's of course National Monument. BLM is responsible for that. How is that specific management structure different than the National Park Service? Is there development allowed in the breaks? What makes that fundamentally different?
Well, first of all, I want to say that the BLM, when it does the monuments and when it establishes the monuments and it overseeing them, always goes through a very rigorous public comment process. And so the public is involved with all of this from the very beginning. The idea that, the BLM kind of keeps people out of the major decisions on whether or not that ground is developed or not is not accurate. There have been thousands of comments over years, times, in all of these monuments, the establishment of them, the current modern day monuments, including the Missouri Breaks. And so what that does is it just brings a common sense strategy to the whole process, because it allows the public to provide their comments, and the BLM responds in kind. And I think that this is probably one of the best strategies that we have to maintain an adequate and proper use of public lands.
So thinking about the Missouri Breaks, the creation of that was somewhat controversial, right?
Oh, to be sure. It involved private lands and public lands. It involved roads and who controlled those roads, and some of those are still in debate. It involved grazing properties that were used largely for grazing, certainly some antiquities of the tribal sort that I think are important in that area. So it was controversial and involved a lot of these kinds of trade-offs that had to be made. And another point I think to be made is that makes these more controversial today is often they're bigger. And so if you look at Devil's Tower, it's about 1,300 acres. If you look at Bears Ears, it's 1.3 million acres, so it's a tiny fraction for Devil's Tower. You get expansive lands like that, and you're just guaranteed to have more controversy. That said, I think Ryan Zinke's review and pretty much his decision to leave the Upper Missouri Breaks alone is an appropriate one. As I think Shane is pointing out, we fought those battles. They were done. That was 20 plus years ago. There's no reason to go back and try to unscramble the eggs, if you will. I mean, it's a settled issue, I think.
So I hear this a lot, that part of the reason the controversy exists with creating a national monument on the Antiquities Act is some people argue it was not the intent of the act as it was constructed to put aside large swaths of land. However, Teddy Roosevelt put aside the Grand Canyon as a national monument. That was a pretty big swath of land, and the Supreme Court upheld him, isn't it? Is that right?
That's right, yes. The presidents do have authority to create national monuments under the Antiquities Act, and that's what Congress decided they were going to extend to the president in 1906. And so, there is controversy. The bigger the monument, of course, the more controversy there's going to be, because there's going to be more people involved. But all of these monuments are established, again, through a painstaking process of public input. Thousands of comments are made. And in the case of the Missouri Breaks National Monument, that was a very long process, took decades. And when the decision was finally made by President Clinton, not everyone agreed. But statistics say that 77% of Montanans support public lands, and so we have to assume that 77% of Montanans also probably supported the Missouri Breaks Monument.
What can I do up at the Breaks, and what can't I do? I can go recreate, right? I can go do that.
Yeah.
Can I use motorized transport up on the Missouri River?
On the river itself, I think you can, but I don't know the answer to the river itself. There are places where you can use motorized transport, places where you can't. You can't just take your four-wheeler out there and plow up and down the breaks anywhere you want, but you can stay on roads. There are roads that are private that you can't use, and again, as I said earlier, some of those are still in question and are fought over.
Are there grazing leases up in the Missouri Breaks?
I believe so.
Yeah.
And again, these kinds of leases, like grazing, have far less of an impact, I would argue at least, than does a four-wheeler driving up and down willy-nilly. And I don't believe there's any oil development in the breaks in the National Monument, but some monuments can have that. It's not, again, it's as Shane has pointed out, it's up to the agencies to determine just what will and will not happen. Park Service much more constrained.
I tell you what you can do is take your children to the Missouri Breaks, take your family, take your grandparents, walk anywhere you want. You know, park your car, just go anywhere where you feel like it. Find a nice spot in the shade if you can find one. Have a picnic lunch. Enjoy each other's company in the quiet solitude of that sacred spot. That's something that you can do, and thankfully, because it is a national monument, we have that reserved for future generations to be able to enjoy that same privilege.
If national monument status were changed and it were revoked, and I think there's some debate about whether you could. Let's talk Bears Ears, because that's obviously the place that's a bit more controversial.
Yeah.
Created at the end of the Obama administration,
Yeah.
and it seems to be the case that the Secretary of Interior is thinking about changing some of the boundaries. The first question is this. Let's just talk about, can the president unilaterally say, you know what, I'm going to go back and cut back some of the national monuments created by a president? Is that possible?
Well, first of all, there's nothing in the Antiquities Act that says the president can do that. And hundreds of legal scholars have already commented and said that there is nothing, there is no way that the president can do that. And so that's just a basic answer to that question there.
But if I can, that said, it is an act of the president. It's not, Congress didn't pass it, so it's like an executive order in a sense. And so Obama had executive orders. Trump came in and said, I revoke those. And so there is, Shane is correct, there's lots of legal discussion. Unfortunately, neither of us are lawyers. But there's lots of legal discussion about this. And I think it'll, if Zinke does say we need to review and restructure it in some way, this will end up in the courts.
Yeah.
It won't be a stroke of the pen that says Bears Ears will now be whatever size and whatever area.
But at the end of the day, that's the way our Constitution is designed. I mean, there's this contest between the executive, the legislative branch, and the courts, and the courts to some degree act as kind of a referee. So even if we're unclear, the courts can come and step in and say yes or no, that's clearly not within the intent. So it is possible that Zinke could recommend this.
Yes.
The president could come in. Let's try to shrink those borders, and then we have a fight on our hands.
That's right.
And I don't think it's going to be just shrink the borders. I think it will be, not privy to what he's thinking, but I think it'll be, let's take this section out and add this section, or let's make sure Grand Gulch, for example, clearly an Anasazi site, beautiful cliff dwellings that are under no real protection now. I think that'll be, let's make sure Grand Gulch stays in, and this area over here that might have oil potential stays out. That's my guess. So it won't just be shrinking it from 1.3 to 0.3 or some other number. It'll be reconfiguring.
But if we did change the boundaries on Bears Ears, and let's say theoretically the Missouri Breaks, I mean, at the end of the day, it's still going to be federally owned, but the axis would potentially change. Is that right? Is that that's what you're suggesting? Is that if we take it out of the national monument status, we return it directly to the BLM, and we put out mineral leases, then I can't necessarily walk with my family in that area that's been leased out. Is that correct?
That's correct. And so that's one of the reasons why we want to protect it in perpetuity, to make sure that the places that are available now are going to be available 100 years from now. And as time goes by, all of us know and understand that those places that have been set aside will only grow in value. You know, here in Montana, we have a $6 billion economy based on our public lands. That's a pretty sustainable economy, and I'm pretty sure that all of the western states see something similar to that.
But one of the biggest arguments that's made against creating these national monuments, and I hear this a lot in Utah, I hear this about Bears Ears, I hear this about Grand Escalante at the same time, is that, look, you have dramatically changed the economic prospects for the counties there. So now what you're saying is you can't develop oil and gas, you can't develop timber, you might take some grazing leases out. That's a loss of value, though, too. Does the recreation end make up for for that in terms of the loss of values from the other economic activities. Now you can't do that anymore.
Well, as far as a sustainable economy, it definitely does. We've seen many mine towns, many mines in Montana boom and bust. Ghost towns are pretty common here in Montana. If you get a town that's based on a sound economy, based on tourism, clean economy, sustainable, that's something that is going to always be there. It's going to be there for their children. It's going to provide jobs for them. And I think that if we go in and we start to develop these places on basically minerals and extractions are just a one-time deal, that's not in our best interest for the long term.
Now, Terry, you've studied this a bit throughout your career. What's your response to this question?
Well, I think that trying to do a cost-benefit analysis is, even though I'm an economist and that's supposedly what we do, I don't think I don't have much faith in those. It is true that jobs are created when guides take people floating on the Missouri, or it is true that jobs are created when people use services of local communities in their backpacking efforts. But to try to put a number on which one creates more economic value, I think is really not the issue. The issue is who captures these values. And the existing people in the counties who have grazing permits or who have logging operations or who are involved in oil and gas development, they lose and they don't like it. That's why it's controversial. Who wins? Well, the local backpack shop says, I like it better because now people are going to come and buy freeze-dried food. We trot out these numbers. I mean, nationally the number is over $600 billion created by the recreation industry. But I say go into the REI store here in Bozeman, Montana, and show me the goods that really are related to a national monument like Bears Ears. I mean, there's the North Face parka that's worn by somebody who traipses up and down Main Street of Bozeman looking cool in the North Face parka, and they're not going to be backpacking in the Bears Ears. So those numbers don't mean a whole lot in that way. It isn't to say that there aren't jobs created by recreation and aren't jobs created by other kinds of development. And again, therein lies the controversy.
I agree 100% with Terry that you can't really put a quantitative estimate on all these things because it kind of distracts us from the main point. One of the main points about public lands is that they enrich our lives. And how do you put a dollar figure on that? Being able to take your grandparents and your children to sacred places that have been set aside, all these millions of acres here in Montana, to have those at our disposal. Many of us in Montana grew up in a household that lived paycheck to paycheck. And a lot of us are still in that same kind of financial situation. We don't have the money to take our family for a 2-week private tour on a private resort. And so we look at these public lands as our form of wealth. And I think everybody agrees that, like John Denver said, thank God I'm a country boy. Looking at these mountains and the blue sky and the rivers and knowing that those all belong to all of us. I don't think you can put a price tag on that.
But still, I think we have to be careful to not gloss over the fact that we have to ask how much is enough. And I think that's the issue with Bears Ear. Bears Ears has these places like Grand Gulch that clearly should be protected under the Antiquities Act. They're protected under other kinds of legislation that protects especially the Native American sites, and I think that's totally appropriate. Mm-hmm. Does it have to be the whole 1.35 million acres? I think not, and I think that's what Zinke's likely to find. And then there's the question of whatever the size is, how ought it to be managed and who ought to be in the management position. And here, under the creation of the Bears Ears, Obama said, we will give Native Americans consultation rights. Yeah. If I were a Native American, I'd be saying, I'm not sure I want just consultation rights. So I consult you and you say, we shouldn't do this. And I say, well, thank you for your consultation. It doesn't give the Native Americans what I think ought to be their right, a right to have a say. Maybe the Native Americans who really consider those their sacred sites would say, Anderson ought not to be coming in here. And that ought to be the way it is. Native Americans should have much more say in protection of the antiquities that are clearly related to their heritage.
Is there a better existing model than what's going on at Bears Ears in terms of Native American consultation?
Well, I think the Canyon de Chelly, there are 4 units in the Park Service that are managed pretty much by tribes, by Native Americans. And I think in the Bears Ears case, there's a coalition in that area that could easily be put together to at least be a real part of management, not just consultation. So I think the models are there, and it's part of what I think antiquities are about. It's what I think the Antiquities Act was about, and it's the right thing to do.
So when I moved to Montana, I was basically told that I was getting paid partly in scenery at Montana State.
That's right.
But at the end of the day,
How does it taste?
Well, that's the thing is, right, at the end of the day, I can't eat the mountains.
No.
What do you tell somebody who's sitting there in southern Utah that has a gas lease in federal land that's all of a sudden made into a monument that person potentially can't act upon it? How do you tell that person that's made some economic choices, oh, sorry, what's the recourse for that fella?
Well, first of all, there's no cut and dry answer to that. I mean, there ought to be some way that fella has some type of an opportunity to negotiate, because we don't want to shut people down from being able to make money off of an opportunity on the landscape. And so, I don't think that scenario that you just described is very all that common. First of all, I don't know out of an incident like that. Most of these monuments and these areas that have been set aside do work with the public to there's some small amount of development. But I would say to that individual, if in fact that they're not allowed to drill or mine or whatever it is that they want to do on that land, that there are other alternatives, for a vibrant economy. That mineral extraction is not always the end answer to what we're looking for in our economy, and that they have to open their eyes to that. My ancestors lived here for over 13,000 years hunting buffalo. One day all the buffalo were gone. What did people tell us? What was the message from the government? Was it, sorry, all your buffalo are gone now, you're going to have to eat the scenery? I mean, so we're not the only people that have been faced with this kind of conundrum, that you base your way of life on something and now it's illegal or it's no longer available. But the fact is that we've survived, and people do survive. They find ways to flourish and thrive in the face of obstacles.
One of the things that Congress can do, of course, right, is that they can revise the Antiquities Act. And you see over and over every congressional session, bills are put in place saying, let's take the Antiquities Act, and it no longer applies to Montana or X or Y or Z. And in fact, in Wyoming, the Antiquities Act doesn't apply, except in very small circumstances, and in Alaska as well. So given that Congress could always just go change the Antiquities Act and revoke that power, isn't it in our best interest to try to make these declarations less controversial? Otherwise, the entire power will be taken away. Terry, what do you think?
Well, Congress could make those changes, but if there was an act that needs to be changed, it'd be the Endangered Species Act, in my opinion. And we know that just seems dead on arrival any time it's brought up. So I don't think Congress is going to make that change. And I agree with you then. The question is, are there ways to make it a little less controversial? And I think one of the ways is to not have them so encompassing. I don't think Bears Ears has to be 1.35 million. And another way is to make sure the people with a direct stake, so the people who have these mining or mineral interests or grazing interests, have much more say than just the public comment. We all know we can fill out our postcard and send it to our congressman, and they count it as there's a public comment, and it's just a pre-programmed postcard. So the people who are directly involved, and this comes back to Native Americans, they should be cut in far more in the not just consultation, but actually how the management. I think if you can narrow the stakeholders, if you will, to the people who really truly have a stake, not the person who lives in North Carolina and says, oh, I care about antiquities. The people who live with it, if they're the ones involved from the start, I think it will be less controversial.
Well, Shane, let's look at the fact that national monument status could be revoked and has been revoked in the past. We have an example right here in Montana, right? We have Lewis and Clark Caverns. That was a national monument. Congress transferred that to the state of Montana. It's managed by the state of Montana. I was just there about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah,
I thought it was
it's a great
great.
spot.
Well, why can't we just maybe transfer some of this land to the state? There's a movement to do that. Why don't we transfer the Missouri breaks from the federal government to Montana to have better local management? Same thing with Bears Ears too.
Well, I'm not sure it would equate to better local management. First of all, the Lewis and Clark Caverns, which by the way are awesome, beautiful thing. All my children have gone, I've gone for years. Those came about, that whole process of that land transfer onto the state came about during the Great Depression. You know, this country was in an economic crisis at that time. And I don't think there's any way to really revisit that and say, you know, this was just something that is common practice. I think that, you know, anything that happened in the 1930s is going to be viewed within the lens of the economic Great Depression. And so I think that was an anomaly. I think that if we were to think about transferring these sites like the Little Bighorn battlefield or Missouri Breaks or even Pomp's Pillar over to the state of Montana, I think we're taking a big gamble. We're taking a risk that our state is not going to have, you know, the funds to maintain those things in perpetuity. And as long as they remain federal, then at least we have an opportunity to tap into those funds that are national.
Okay.
As a fellow native of Montana, I trust my state more than I trust those people back in Washington, D.C. in perpetuity. And I don't think it's just a matter of the funding. And indeed, Congress is facing budget constraints all the time, and those are going to get tougher. And as they do, I think we're going to see funding. After all, who gets cut first? It's the national parks. You know, close that campground, cut this off. I think that states do have a good track record. Montana is a great example with its state parks, Lewis and Clark being one. I think this is part of what will take some of the controversy out. Get the states and the stakeholders in the states more involved in both the designation and the management. That will move us a long way. And finally, I'd say, you know, people who don that North Face parka and buy that $400 backpack ought to be paying higher fees to use these areas. If you want to backpack in these, then you go and you pay a permit fee that helps raise funds directly, as it does with Lewis and Clark, directly goes to management of that area. That would help a lot.
We've got about less than 2 minutes left. There's discussion also that maybe we need to have more federal-private partnerships to bring more services to our monuments and stuff like that. What do you think of that? And just very quickly, if we had Ryan Zinke just had an op-ed in the Fox News about this issue. Are these federal-private partnerships good, bad, different? What do you think?
I think they have a great deal of hope, offer a great deal of hope for management, for taking some of the controversy out, for dealing with some of the funding issues. There are some examples of that, and where they exist. But they have to include what's the good part of the private. Getting the incentives right for these private partners to not just maybe make money, but to reinvest that money so that these things are around, which is what we want.
Shane, what do you think about these federal-private partnerships? Good, bad? We got about 30 seconds left.
Well, I think it could be really bad, you know, because typically private partnership means that people have the type of money to be in that partnership. And that, again, leaves out most of us regular Montanans who don't go down to REI and buy, you know, $100 backpacks, $300 parkas, $400, whatever it is. We go up there with our Levi's and our cowboy boots and our shirts and our hats, and we enjoy our public land. And at that time, we're equal to all the billionaires and millionaires that come here. We're all on the level playing field when we're on those public lands, and that's one of the most beautiful things about Montana.
Well, I'll tell you, as someone who's moved to Montana, I appreciate our public lands. I love recreating on them, and I'm sure this conversation will continue. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming to talk about national monuments and public lands, and we'll see you again on Face the State.
You've been watching Face the State, a presentation of MTN, the Montana Television Network.